My name is Lauren Morris. I'm the moderator for this event tonight. I am a journalist based in Austin, Texas, and I have been to Ukraine in May and April of 2023. I was very compelled to go based on what I was seeing in social media that was in drastic contrast to what I was reading about in the military channels on Telegram, and also in my studies concerning the Chechen President Ramzan Kadyrov and what the Chechen army was doing from the Donbass down into Mariupol and in Bucha. And I was very compelled to go over to Ukraine. It took me a couple of months to plan my trip, and I went, and I don't regret it. Thinking that maybe I was going to go over there and come back with a lot of stories that I might want to put out, for influence purposes on social media and that kind of thing, make a small documentary, take some photos and that kind of thing. My trip didn't really quite work out like that because I feel like I came home a changed person. I saw and experienced things from the minute I stepped onto the ground in Krakow, Poland. I immediately was met with refugees and children. I marched in the streets with the children, saying, "Stand with Ukraine." I videotaped them. I talked with them. I talked with the university students. And I have to say, I've never seen people so traumatized and shattered in my life. And that was quite an experience. And then when I went over into Ukraine, I met with 3 NGOs. One is called Prisoner's Voice. They work with the Center for Civil Liberties. And I also met with another NGO called Save Ukraine. They do some extractions of children who have been kidnapped. And the only thing that I regret is that I didn't spend another 5 days, because I could have covered a lot more ground and did a lot more things. I jumped in an Uber and I went to Bucha, Irpin, and Hostomel. And where my driver would let me get out of the car, which certainly wasn't any of the forest area or anything like that. We stayed strictly on the streets. I walked among the massacre sites. I stood near the graves. I put flowers on the graves. I prayed in the churches. And I went to the apartment buildings where they had been bombed. And this was a year later. So of course it was certainly cleaned up and life was going on, but it was quite an experience. One evening in my hotel, a drone flew by and it was detonated right in front of me. I heard sirens. It was just, and I spent a lot of time at standing at Maidan Square. And I saw a lot of photographs of people that had died there. It's a shrine to the people. It's got probably over 50 tall. It's a graphic novel that is there at the square now, and it's bigger than life, and it's fantastic. And of course, as you walk around Maidan Square, you can see the damage in the concrete where the protests happened during the Revolution of Dignity, the cracks in the glass. And there was also a wall there, which was kind of a messaging wall. And so whatever country that you were from, you could pin a message up on the wall. And so that was a really interesting experience as well. I specifically learned a great deal more than I had known about what the Russians were doing to the soldiers that they would kidnap, Prisoners Voice told me that the first couple months of the invasion, that they had rounded up about 1,100 activists, and most of these people are in their between age 25 and age 45. And they removed them and they put them in filtration camps. And then some of them went up to be in prison camps, in Russia. And when they returned, a lot of them were missing fingers and ears and various things like this. And it's very hard to get them to talk about what the Russians did to them, because people are still disappearing right and left off the streets. So I felt when I was there, I noticed that a lot of people were not carrying cell phones and videotaping and doing that kind of thing. So I was very careful with who I videotaped and who I didn't. And I basically just went on a gut instinct for that. And when I went to the Center for Civil Liberties and I sat down, these are the people who are documenting war crimes. They are Nobel Prize winners. And I sat down with them. They showed me, their database, and we talked. And I had taken all of my camera equipment, and I just felt like I didn't want to videotape them or interview them. It was a gut instinct at the time. I audio recorded our interview, but I did not videotape them. And I think it was the right thing to do, because I feel like people don't have a good idea sometimes for their own safety and their own security. And so I just felt like it wasn't, my place to put them on camera, and so I didn't. But I was, very compelled to go. And that's really all that I wanted to say tonight as I moderate this event. And
I don't want to sound overly, what would be the word, overly cute in posing a question, but I'll pose a question anyway, which is, well, so what? There is a lot of misery and injustice globally, as we know, historically. And what I'd like to develop for everybody, though, is what I call the global deterrence credibility issue that we have in Russia's war against Ukraine, and the attempt by the Western allies, and by Western allies, I would include, of course, countries not just geographically in the West, but Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and other countries that share our value system. And the first thing that you hear from the commentators and the analysts is, the saving of the so-called rules-based international order, which sounds terribly grandiose. That was pretty much put into place under the leadership of the United States, primarily after World War II. And it was intended, of course, to prevent something like that from occurring again. Part of that is the freedom of the seas, the law of navigation, free navigation. The United States in particular, of course, with England, has a very strong maritime tradition. And without travel on the high seas being open and free, we can pretty much dismiss the economic viability of a lot of countries around the world. It'll probably surprise a lot of people to know that Russia's usurpation of Ukrainian jurisdiction, both direct and indirect, on the Black Sea, equals an area the size of South Korea. So that immediately gives you some sense of proportionality. But the essence of our credibility lies in the fact that Ukraine is not just a coral atoll in the South Pacific. And we have the intersection of, I would say, three vectors that Russia is focusing on. And one is the destruction of that so-called order But it comes not just with territorial aggrandizement and annexation, but the expressed intention of destroying Ukraine as a state, and as well destroying Ukrainians as a nation. The calls for genocide are open, they're vitriolic, they're repetitive, they're not hidden, they are not masked, they are not clouded. And at the same time, they are an everyday occurrence to the point where you reach the point of banality, given the repetitiveness with which Russian press and other spokespeople pronounced the need for an outright genocide of Ukraine. So if we came out of World War I saying never again, and Putin is saying, well, you just watch me, the question becomes, well, all right, so what is the West going to do about it? Now, how does all of that play out on a practical basis? Well, the most immediate analogy people draw when we talk about our credibility, they'll look to China, North Korea, Iran, and the like, and we haven't even begun to talk about Latin America. I'm not going to get into that today. But the reference to Taiwan and the precedential consequences, good or bad, to what may happen in Taiwan. Well, most people do not know, and I have yet to hear anybody on the Hill, in the White House, or even in the Pentagon mention that the issues of territorial integrity and sovereignty, they don't apply to Taiwan. Why not? Well, because we withdrew recognition of Taiwan in 1979, extended it to Red China. Taiwan is scarcely recognized by any country that you would ever meet or understand or recognize in the world. They're not a member of the UN. And that means that if Ukraine stands or falls, depending on which way it goes, and because Ukraine is internationally recognized and has been a member of the United Nations, although in a prior incarnation for many, many generations, if we fail in Ukraine, where these issues are front and center, then there's a multiplier effect against us in terms of our credibility of standing behind and supporting Taiwan, where these issues of territorial integrity and sovereignty don't apply. Right off the bat, we have that multiplier effect. It's like leverage in the stock market, with the stock market taking a tumble. And if you're leveraged to the hilt, you're dead in the water. That effect, that what I call multiplier effect, is not mentioned by anybody at all that I've heard. But there's a lot more to this. When the Soviet Union fell apart, the nail in the coffin and the definitive nature of the dissolution of the Soviet Union was ensured by the recoupment of independence by Ukraine. Prior to that, we had the Baltics and the like, but it was only when Ukraine declared independence that it was clear that the Soviet Union was going to implode. And as a consequence, the United States recouped, as close as it could have, its number one position in the world, comparable to what it had after World War II. Of course, not at that level, but nevertheless, we were the only superpower. We were the only country in the world that had strategic nuclear dominance, economically and everything else. So it is not facetious to say that Ukrainian independence made America great again. And it is the ultimate anomaly that the Made America Great Again movement in the Republican Party in the United States doesn't see it, doesn't recognize it, and would be stunned, I think, to learn that. We have a second issue, which makes the case for Ukraine stronger than it would be if it was some other country. And that is, of course, the fact that we disarmed the wrong country. We disarmed Ukraine, both in terms of its nuclear arsenal, the third largest in the world at that time, equal to what China, France, and England had. And a lot of commentators now argue, well, the command and control was maintained in Moscow, and therefore it didn't make any difference if Ukraine lost its nuclear arsenal. Well, if that was the case, then why were we so apoplectic about making sure that Ukraine surrendered the nukes, and not only to the United States, but in fact to Russia, of all countries? And you go back on the record and you can read just absolutely fantastic statements by our experts and think tankers and government officials about the fact that with Ukraine disarming, it will make it safe. And in addition to that, as we know, partially with the participation of then Senator Obama, the United States destroyed much of Ukraine's conventional weaponry, and the call sign was for the safety of the Ukrainian people. The third element in all of this, and there has been some discussion and writing by certain people on the panel today, the plan to take down the United States going back at least to 1997, the treatise by Alexander Dugin, which was mandatory reading for the General Staff Academy in Russia, and the notion that Russia would had to exploit divisions, fractures in American society, focusing on racism, exploiting isolationist tendencies, separating Britain from the EU, which happened, as we know. And tied up in all of this was the recognition and the advocacy that Ukraine cannot exist, and why it cannot exist and should not exist, and why it's a danger to Russia. We'll talk about a little bit later on. Another aspect about the significance of standing behind Ukraine is very simply that Ukraine is the only country in the world that is fighting directly against the architect of what we have come to know to be Islamic terrorism. Back in the 1970s, Moscow converted Arab nationalism in a petri dish at Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow, and basically turning terrorism as a tool against the West, primarily against the greatest Satan of them all, of course, which was the United States. We never go back that far up the chain. Although we know it, our intelligence services knew it at the time and know it now, but politicians in the United States and in Europe uniformly were not interested in their populations learning about the Russian curation of Islamic terrorism, the financing, the organization, the direction, and including homegrown terrorism from the Irish Republican Army to the Red Brigade, and the terrorism that occurred in Europe, and of course, the use of the airplane as a terror weapon that came out of the halls of the KGB in Moscow. We have as well the fact that today, Russia controls the largest nuclear plant in Europe with 5 nuclear reactors. And if we have nuclear leakage from that reactor, and heaven forbid we have an explosion, a massive release, as we had in Chernobyl in 1986, that will be carried globally. You never know which way the wind blows. It is not an impediment to Russia, if it wants to do so, that radiation will blow also onto Russian territory. It doesn't matter to them if the calculus for something like that outweighs that eventuality. we have at least two other or three other issues. One is the question, how do you redeem an infamy? One was the forced starvation of Ukraine in 1932 and 33, precisely at the time that we extended diplomatic recognition to the Soviet Union on November 16th of 1933. And the estimates run anywhere from approximately 4 to a little bit over 10 million victims in the course of about a year. If you want to know what will happen to Ukraine if Putin is successful, you can also already make certain extrapolations of the policies that he has followed in destroying Ukrainian agriculture, poisoning the land, destroying the equipment, storage facilities, animals, burning grain crops. The attacks on grain transport facilities and storage facilities in Odessa is largely geared right now in order to cut short foreign exchange for Ukraine. But the starvation of the population across the board in order to break final resistance, we have a model for that already, as I say, in 1932 and 1933. The second point that I can make is that after World War II, and I'm still talking about the sense of a moral obligation, a culpability, forgetting about what's happening on the ground right now. After World War II, the survivors of that starvation, which incidentally, Raphael Lemkin, who was the father of the UN Genocide Convention, characterized that starvation as classic Soviet genocide. Genocide survivors who escaped the Soviet Union during War II and wound up in the DP camps of Europe were rounded up by US and British troops, reporting to NKVD headquarters in Frankfurt, Germany, and shipped back to the Soviet Union. Some were killed, some were beaten. It was a bloody affair. And there was at least one case of a British officer who was court-martialed in London because he refused to follow orders of his NKVD handler. Informants from the Ukrainian underground at the time informed Army intelligence with a memo to OSS offices in Washington that Stalin was going to assassinate General George Patton. Stalin had flown in Sudoplatov, his premier assassin, into the headquarters in Frankfurt. That warning was ignored, and as a matter of fact, an arrest warrant was issued for the U.S. Army intelligence services to arrest the informants that warned them about that. So as you can see, we have a plethora of examples in history that stand behind us, which factor into the multiplier effect of standing behind or not standing behind Ukraine. The world order, ironically enough, if you know World War II history, if you really know it, 98% of the people who profess to know it will not know this fact. The purpose of World War II for Hitler in Europe was to occupy and colonize Ukraine. So it's no wonder that Ukraine had a loss of 8 to 9 million people in World War II. And according to Yale's Tim Snyder and Oxford's Norman Davies, Ukraine had the highest loss of any country in the world in terms of loss of its humanity, which was the price paid for the establishment of this world order that we're talking about right now. So I'm not sure whether irony or hypocrisy or what the appropriate word would be, but if that world order doesn't stand behind and secure Ukraine, then I think our credibility, both with our foes and with our allies, is virtually destroyed. It's not enough to have a strong military and economic capacity if you can't apply it. We have 25% of the world economy. Russia's economy is the size of New York City. If you throw in the rest of the West, we have over 1 billion people and over half of the world economy. Russia's population is about 145 million. So somebody explain to me how they're able to achieve what they have been able to achieve through the last 20 decades, excuse me, 2 decades, 20 years. I could go on. I'm going to cut it short here. I haven't timed myself, but I'm guessing 15 minutes, maybe even more, has passed. And we could circle around then on the Q&A as well.
Thank you, Victor. And I waited to introduce you, and because I knew we were going to have some latecomers. So I will do that now. Victor Rudd has spoken before and written for various audiences overseas and domestically on issues affecting U.S., Russia, and Ukraine relations. He chairs the Committee on Foreign Affairs of the Ukrainian American Bar Association and is also the senior advisor to the Center for Eastern European Democracy. He was also counsel to the U.S. public member to the Helsinki Accords Review Conference in Madrid. He is an honors graduate of Harvard College and Duke Law School. We are very pleased to have Victor's perspective and his integrity and his vast knowledge to be a part of our group. And we thank you for showing up, Victor. And if anyone has a question for Victor, just drop it in the chat for now, and we'll do Q&A later. How about we go to Claire Lopez next?
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. I think that would be a good sequel to what Victor was talking about in terms of the world order, and our own group and others here too tonight might have heard me talk about the Westphalian concept, the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, following on the horrific 30 Years' War in Europe that murdered maybe a third of the population in Europe. Decided that from then on, they would at least aspire to, as the ideal, a sovereign nation-state system behind secure, defensible borders. At least that's the ideal. Let me just say very quickly, my own background began, I guess you could say, in grad school. I was at the Maxwell School of Syracuse University, where my master's was international relations, but in a subgroup that was a Russia-focused group. And lo and behold, the CIA came to campus to interviewed a number of members of our class, including me. And for some reason, they liked me, I guess. 14 months later, that's how long the process took, I began in 1980 and served until 2000 in Russia Division of the Director of Operations of CIA. That basically meant that I chased Russians and KGB all over the world. Travel is one of the things I'd always wanted to do, so I got to see the world, and focusing in each place that I went on Russia, Russians, KGB, but also whatever that local situation happened to be, which over the years included, civil war in El Salvador under mortar and rocket fire that took off a chunk of our roof, but we're okay. And government collapse in Bulgaria post 1991. What else? Category 3 cyclones coming out of the Indian Ocean in Mogadishu or in Mauritius. I was in Mogadishu as well, but I got to see the world. But again, that's where my first focus really on Russia comes from. So it's from that background that I went on to other national security issues, including after 9/11. It was not a hard transition in terms of tyranny to tyranny to go from Russia to a study of Islam and the Middle East. Iran is my particular focus there, has always been, and more recently, China. And in a way, all of these now come together, don't they? You've got Russia, you've got China, you've got Iran, You could add in North Korea, perhaps Venezuela and Cuba as well. But those are the big three rogues, if you will, in the world today in an alliance, unofficial perhaps, but an alliance. And we're seeing them come together very much so in Ukraine. But back to the concept of the Westphalian ideal, often honored more in the breach than in reality, but the ideal of the sovereign nation state being the foundational um, entity of that world order. And that means our borders as well as Ukraine's borders. And it's why I think that Ukraine's borders, Ukraine, is worth defending. Because if we hold valuable that sovereign nation state system for ourselves, for our other friends and allies, for Israel, then it holds for Ukraine. Because if Ukraine is allowed to fall, and I'm going to talk about this here tonight very briefly, if Ukraine falls, Putin is not going to stop. And we know this because he tells us. I don't know why it has always been kind of really hard for people, even our top national security people in State Department, Defense Department, National Security Council, to understand that when people say something in terms of their ambitions and intent and motivation, we probably at least ought to listen. Maybe not believe every word, but listen. We did not listen, for example, to the Ayatollah Khomeini, did we? When he was writing for decades out of Qom in the seminary city of Iran, his ideology, Vilayat Faqih, which means the rule of the jurisprudent, his ambition to rule over the country, then Persia, now Iran, both in a theological and a political sense. We blew him off. Our State Department, our intelligence community, I don't even know if they spoke Farsi, but they blew him off. And here we are. So let's get to Russia. So there's been a lot of discussion, certainly after February of 2022. It's now 2 years on plus. A lot of discussion about the intent and the motivation of Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia. Oh, by the way, he just won another election for 6 years as president. I think he got something like 120% of the vote. That's what I heard anyway. Anyway, he's going to be around, all things being equal, for another 6 years or so. But his speeches and his essays and articles, things that he's written, have been translated into English online for a very long time. There is no reason why anybody in our national security leadership or any of us, time permitting, would not be able to read that because it's all there. But what I wanted to mention most recently was something, I'll give you a couple of good websites, reference sites. One of these is the Institute for the Study of War. You may know about that. It's headed up by former, or I should say retired, General Jack Keane, who is the, I guess he's the chairman of the board at ISW, Institute for the Study of War. A very good institution, very good think tank, headquartered in Washington, D.C. And they put out a daily bulletin. If you would be interested, you can sign up for that for free. Comes out every single day with a summary of where we're at with Ukraine, and then a separate newsletter that comes out daily as well, and that is about the Middle East and about Israel and Gaza and Hamas. In any case, the ISW puts out, like I said, these daily reports, and I wanted to call our attention. Oh, I should also say that Hudson Institute, another think tank in Washington, D.C., does the same. It's not daily, but it's at least, I guess, about a couple times a week. So I would look at the Hudson Institute as well, a good think tank that puts out these reports, like I said, about twice a week, maybe 3 times a week, about Ukraine, the situation in Ukraine. But I'm going to refer to one from the ISW that comes from March 14th, because before, and like I said, during the beginning at least, and even up until now, of the Russian invasion of Ukraine since February 22, there's been a lot of discussion about why did Putin do this? Everybody knew that his military would be mauled, his economy would be shattered, his standing in the international world, diplomatic circles would be, turned to mud. Expected that the International Court at The Hague, that is the International Criminal Court at The Hague, would do what they have done, which is name him a war criminal and put out a red flag notice for his arrest. We all knew this, and we thought, well, any sane, any logical person, like we think Putin might be, would take all of that into account and would not go ahead. However, this news bulletin out of ISW from March 14 is talking about I guess it was online. I don't think it was a live speech. It was online that the Russian Security Council deputy chairperson, and he was also the one who, played musical chairs with Putin over the presidency for a couple times, Dmitry Medvedev, his name. So he posted online this call for the total, and this echoes what Victor was just saying there, called for the total elimination of the Ukrainian state and its absorption into the Russian Federation under what he was euphemistically laying out a peace formula for an end to the conflict. Rather than read directly from that, the ISW piece, I'm going to go to Ilan Berman, who's a wonderful scholar, he writes at a number of different places. Let me see. He's the senior vice president of the American Foreign Policy Council in Washington, D.C. Know him well, good friend for many years. Very excellent analyst, observer, certainly of this conflict, but of others, also on the Middle East. So let me go turn to him as a summary of what Medvedev had posted. And so what Ilan Berman wrote, I guess, oh yeah, it came out on Telegram. That's where it was. Medvedev's post was on Telegram. He laid out what kind of a peace formula might be acceptable to Moscow. And this gets to the motivation for the invasion in the first place. It all ties in. So his plan, as he wrote it, includes things like the complete and unconditional surrender of Ukraine, the denazification, that is the purge, as Ilan says, of all its entire government. By the way, fascism and Nazis, they ended 75 years ago at the end of the Third Reich. They don't exist anymore. There's no such thing. But there is communism, Marxism, and certainly tyranny across the world. And theirs is one of those tyrannies. So a purge of the entire government of Ukraine, and it wouldn't be just purge, it would be execution up against the wall. Financial compensation to the Kremlin for a war that it itself started. And then, of course, the wholesale absorption of Ukraine into the Russian Federation. And again, Medvedev calls this a soft, this is a quote in translation, but soft Russian formula for peace, a compromise position. Now, it's a little difficult to find where the compromise part comes in. But they're obviously not interested in the slightest in any kind of a negotiated settlement. This is life or death struggle for Ukraine over its existence, its very existence, never mind its identity as a nation, as a people, its independence. And I would go back, maybe back to some more of Putin's own thinking, which Medvedev echoes. And, as I said, Putin has written widely and is posted online in English translation. There's an essay he wrote, that is Putin, in 2021. It's called in English, On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians. And he claimed that the Ukrainian and Russians are historically one united people. Well, yeah, because you know where Russia began? It began in the 900s in a place called Kievan Rus. That's where Russia came from. That was also the cradle of Ukrainian civilization and nationhood too. Well, so he says they're one people, and they were violently and unjustly separated by external nefarious forces. I guess that means us, the West in any case. Putin, used the essay to undermine Ukraine's sovereignty and its claims. I mean, rightful claims of Ukraine and its people over its own political, social, historical, linguistic, cultural development. So again, calls to dissolve all of that, erase Ukraine as an independent country, an independent people. Let me end with this. I know we've got others waiting to speak too. I don't know how many of you may have studied Russian or perhaps Ukrainian. I've studied Russian, of course. Not very fluent in it though. I think I got to a 1+ at one point. But the name Ukraine, the name of the country, is actually 2 words. Ukraina. U means at. Kraina means something like the farthest outpost, the farthest border. Well, the farthest outpost of what? The Russian Empire. That's how Russia thinks about it. It's not how the Ukrainian people think about it. One last note. Harkening back, I just recalled to World War II and the invasion by the Nazis of the German army into Ukraine with that horrific death toll that Victor mentioned to us. I don't know how many of you remember or from history know about something called the Holodomor. Okay, in Russian, Holod means cold, and mor is a derivative of the word for death or killing. So cold, death, killing. And so what Stalin did in the earlier part of 1932 is sent his goons in, his soldiers, throughout Ukraine to confiscate all their crops, all their food stores, take or kill all their animals, the cows, the pigs, the chickens. And if anybody was caught hoarding food or trying to hold it back, they were just shot. And we don't know to this day the toll of the death that ensued from that starvation over the winter of 32, 33, and after that too, really. Didn't end right there. But it's in the millions, 5, 6, 7 million. We really don't even know. I mean, thank you very much, Walter Duranty, communist reporter for the New York Times, who denied, posted to Moscow in those years that anything like this was ever happening. So when the Germans invaded, now skip ahead to 1939, 1940, in World War II, invaded Ukraine, wanted to conquer it. Is there any doubt in our minds why Ukrainians just might have looked at Germans as liberators? Just a thought. They had been conquered many times before. The Lithuanians, the Poles, the Germans had all invaded Ukraine. But World War II, I would think that a mere less than a decade before, the Holodomor was probably still on the minds of those who had survived. Anyway, let me leave it there. We'll open this up for more Q&A at the end, but I want to give everybody else a chance to speak too. Thank you.
Please find her on social media and follow her, Claire Lopez. How about we go to Jeff Nyquist? Jeff is an author and commentator. His books include The Origins of the Fourth World War, The Fool and His Enemy, and The Lies We Believe in. He has been a columnist for WorldNet Daily, Sierra Times, Financial Sense Online, and Epic Times. So welcome to the program, Jeff Nyquist.
Thank you. I'm going to be a little brief. This is a bit of a polemic. It's who gives a damn about Ukraine. Ukraine's been invaded by Russia. We all know its cities have been blasted. with missiles and artillery. It's children kidnapped and put in re-education camps. It's women raped. It's citizens murdered. It's soldiers dying by the tens of thousands. Naturally, I was outraged when the Canadian psychologist Jordan Peterson made a long video about the Ukraine war. And according to Peterson, nobody gives a damn about Ukraine. Now, of course, it's a lie. And I'll demonstrate that briefly, because there are 44 million Ukrainians who must give a damn, and millions more Americans of Ukrainian descent. But more than this, Russia is a military aggressor. And if Russia conquers Ukraine, can we really say then that Latvians, Estonians, Lithuanians, Poles, Finns, Romanians, and Moldovans don't care? They all border this region. They're all next in line. They're next on the chopping block. And if you've been keeping up on the news, Putin and his thugs and flunkies have been threatening all those countries. So how many people and how many nations give a damn? Well, let's add them all up. 44 million Ukrainians, 37 million Poles, 19 million Romanians, 6 million Balts, 5.5 million Finns, 2.6 million Moldovans. That's 114.1 million people. But it doesn't stop there, because there's Europe. There's the whole of Europe, which Russian leaders have talked about dominating, owning, ruling. Gorbachev called it the one common European home. Former President Medvedev spoke of Russia owning Europe from Lisbon to Vladivostok. Does the rest of Europe have a reason to be concerned? I think so. Because if Russia becomes dominant in Europe, freedom in Europe will disappear. And millions will be jailed or liquidated. Economies will be sucked dry. Okay, fine. Jordan Peterson says nobody gives a damn about Ukraine. Maybe he means Canadians or North Americans, So let's look at that. Okay, so if Russia advances on the Baltic states or Poland, he doesn't care either. And if they take Europe, he doesn't care. So, but then one wonders, why should anyone give a damn about Canada or the United States? Well, if Russia dominates Europe and America is cut off from trade from Europe, there's a lot of plugins in our economy that won't work. There would be Russia, China, and Europe would be in a position to apply economic blackmail to the United States. And in strategic terms, the loss of one friendly country leads to the loss of another. Some of us might remember the potato chip commercial where we learned how hard it is to eat just one. Well, if we look at the history of totalitarian dictators, they have a really, really hard time eating just one. Hitler took Austria and the Sudetenland and said he was all done, but then he gobbled up the Czech rump state, and then he went for Poland. We saw Stalin just about invaded every neighboring country around the Soviet Union during his tenure. Mao sent his armies into Tibet, India, and Korea. Deng Xiaoping invaded Vietnam. Look, this is what dictators do. And Putin has already invaded Georgia. He's annexed Crimea. He's gone into Donbass and now the whole of Ukraine. He keeps expanding what he wants to take. So he's right in line with the best of them. So we have a containment problem. And the big question regarding containment is, if it's difficult to contain Russia now when there's 700,000 Ukrainians fighting on the front line, why would it be easier to contain Russia when the smaller armies of Poland and the Baltic states are what is confronting him? And is Romania going to be our line in the sand, or Moldova? Obviously, the easiest point for containment is the first instance, Ukraine. Therefore, it follows that we should give a damn about Ukraine if we give a damn about our allies and our prestige. Furthermore, the American dollar is supported around the world because we defend other countries. If we do not defend them, the dollar will not be supported. Say hello to hyperinflation. Say goodbye to your prosperity. NATO isn't just an alliance, it's a trading system that's overlaid on the alliance. One last note. Russia has more and more and newer types of nuclear warheads and missiles than we do. Half of America's ICBM tests over the last 5 years have failed. Our nuclear arsenal is past its shelf life. Check the statements of the former head of the Strategic Command, Admiral Charles Richard, before Congress in February of 2020. The strategic balance has been shifting against the United States, especially now that Russia is aligned with China, which will soon have a nuclear arsenal as bigger than ours. So a Russian victory in Ukraine threatens the United States because We're Russia's ultimate target and China's ultimate target. So any victory that enlarges and emboldens Russia weakens the United States. So Americans ought to give a damn about Ukraine, despite what the Canadian psychologist says. That's it.
Thank you, Jeff. And I can say from personal experience that the Ukrainians that I met and observed are very united. They want their sovereignty, they want the right to their land, and they want the right to self-governance. And they are united in this. And I find them to be a fierce people. And even though Google does not have a good definition for fierce anymore, they want you to use the word valiant. So the topic of my talk tonight was the valiant Ukrainian people. I do want to say that they are a fierce people. And I experienced that in Poland and Ukraine, and I experienced it again in Romania, where Larry and I were together at the Rebuilding Ukraine Forum. And when they got up and they spoke to us from the Odessa area, and they talked to us about the recent flood and all of the products that they had lost, their agriculture, the animals, and just the raping and pillaging of the land that is going on there. There is a countenance about these people, and they are very determined. And I believe they're going to fight as long as they possibly can. So having said that, I would like to introduce our last speaker and founder of the Conservatives for Ukraine, Trevor Loudon. He is a New Zealand-born US-based author, a public speaker, is a documentary filmmaker. His documentaries are wonderful, by the way, and he's the founder of a website called Key Wiki, which I would encourage you all to take a look at. It's quite interesting. He's a fellow of the American Freedom Alliance and a member of the Committee for the Present Danger China. And he's also a really great guy and a good friend. So we welcome to the program, Mr. Trevor Loudon.
Well, thanks so much, Lauren, and thanks to all the other speakers, and thanks to all those watching now and those who will be watching in the future as we spread this around. Now, look, caring about Ukraine, well, I spent this last summer in Pennsylvania, and everywhere you go, there's Trump flags, and everywhere you go, there's Russian Orthodox churches, and lots of Ukrainians and Poles and Czechs. And that's the same right throughout Ohio, into Minnesota, into Michigan. And these are people who would have once voted Democrat largely, but now they are voting Trump. But they are wavering now because they want to defend Ukraine, and they think that Biden is defending Ukraine, and the Trump supporters don't want to. So to make sure that Trump wins the election, he'd be very, very wise to take that into account and not listen to the Colonel McGregors of the world, who basically regurgitate Russian propaganda ad nauseum. This is what I say. This is, I think Jeff talked about containment. I think ultimately our real goal should be not containment, but defeat of tyranny. We should be trying to do what Reagan did to take down the evil empire, but to finish the job. Because if we just keep trying to contain it all the time, eventually we're going to lose. Eventually we're going to have they're going to wear us down so much that we will eventually lose. And I don't want to just kick this can down the road for my kids and grandchildren to deal with. We need to deal with it now. Now, I believe that when Putin invaded Ukraine, as Claire laid out, there's all these consequences for it. And that leads me to believe that basically Putin knew that he was crossing the Rubicon. And I talk about Putin, but I believe that nothing comes out of Russia that is not sanctioned by the Soloviki, the intelligence services, the senior military officers, the people who really run Russia. And I don't really believe it's Putin that runs Russia. It's an oligarchy run by a network of very powerful people who grew up hating the United States under the old Soviet dream of world domination. they or their sons are still in power today. So he knew he was crossing the line. He has made very deep alliances with the Chinese communists. They've never, I don't think they ever were really not friends. Working with Iran, working with North Korea, working with the communists of Latin America, and even Western governments around the world, which are chock full of communist leaders, from Trudeau in Canada to Albanese in Australia, and the previous Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, who is now thankfully gone. But so basically, I believe the invasion of Ukraine was the first step in the physical changing of the world balance of power, with the eventual goal of destroying the United States, dominating Europe, and allowing China to dominate Asia, Africa, Latin America, etc. So what we're seeing here is Ukraine is the kinetic aspect of a change in the world balance of power. We're already seeing the BRICS nations working to take down the US dollar, and Jeff is 100% right. Most Americans fail to understand that their government has been deficit spending across the world for decades and exporting their inflation across the world. Every trading partner with America subsidizes America's deficit all of the time. But they are willing to do that because America has defended them and kept the world stable. Well, if America stops defending the world and keeping the world stable, why would they trade our dollars? Why wouldn't they go for gold-backed Chinese currency? That will mean all of our deficit spending will come home to roost, and we'll be paying huge premiums on our massive national debt. And I think that will just completely collapse the economy. So Americans need to understand that, yes, NATO needs to do more, but this talk of America paying too much, well, it's partly true, but it is offset a lot by the inflation that we've been exporting around the world for decades. And most Americans do not get that concept whatsoever. So right now, the Russians are working with the left around the world. They still have the traditional communist parties under their control. Some of them will make, anti-Putin statements, but they will all blame NATO for the war. The goal is to destroy NATO. That's always been the goal. If you can destroy NATO, you can take Europe. If you can take Europe, you can take the world. That's really the logic of this. But the other thing that's really a newer phenomenon, and this has been championed by people like Alexander Dugin, is the outreach to the fascist right, to the nationalistic right all around the world. We see this with Marie Le Pen in France. We see this with the AfD in Germany. We see this with the Golden Dawn in Greece. And we see it with the new right, the alt-right in America, the Richard Spencers and the David Dukes, and all the people who are following along their line. And I would put Tucker Carlson in that category. I'd put Gateway Pundit in that category, and many others. They are basically following the line put out there that Putin is the champion of Christianity. Putin's going to save us from George Soros and the Muslim hordes. Putin's going to save us from Western decadence, because Putin is presiding over a Christian nation, a nation where only 6% of people go to church every week, a nation where the anti-proselytization laws tell you cannot bring your child up outside the Orthodox Church. You cannot bring them to your church till you're 18. That is, if you're Pentecostal or an evangelical or Baptist or whatever, where abortion rates are 4 times the size of America's, etc., etc., etc. But they've got a whole chunk for the last 15 years. They've been propagandizing the American and European right to believe that Russia's a Christian country. They're going to save us from the decadence of the West, and the decadence that they gave us through the communist parties of wokeism, all this comes out of the communist parties that were always sponsored by Russia. So, and I believe that the Republican Party right now is walking into a massive trap because they've so divided the Republicans, because Joe Biden pretends to help Ukraine. I joke that Ukraine and Russia have the same four enemies. They have Russia, China, Iran, and the Biden administration. You know, if Biden's your friend, you don't need enemies. He's been slow walking everything that they possibly could. He invited the attack on Ukraine by saying a limited incursion would not warrant an American response. He has been doing little side deals with Putin. The sanctions have actually helped Putin, and Biden has deliberately kept the price of oil up by restricting American supplies, which is what Putin is financing his war with. So the point I'm getting here is, this is a battle between the common people and the communist and globalist oligarchs. Globalism is communism. Communism is globalism. Putin is smack in the middle of it. Xi is smack in the middle of it. They are allies. And so we, the American people who are trying to save this nation, have far more in common with the good people of Israel, the good people of Ukraine, the people of Poland and the Baltic states, who have fought for their liberties, just like America did. They should be our natural allies. And the Republican Party, unfortunately, large elements of it have been so gulled by the Russian propaganda and so fooled into thinking that Biden actually cares about Ukraine, that they are on the verge of snatching defeat from the jaws of victory by cutting off aid to Ukraine. And why would Biden care? If Ukraine can win despite all of this, he will take full credit through election year. If Ukraine loses and there's slaughter and refugees all through Europe, Biden will say, "You Republicans, I always said you were pro-Russian." They will walk straight into a massive trap. So to sum up, I say this is way more than the Ukraine. This is the forces of the evil empire have crossed the Rubicon. They know there's no going back. They can never be contained now. They can only be defeated. And if Ukraine can be given the support needed to defeat Putin's army, I believe there could be a new dispensation in Russia, that Putin could be out of there. I think the mullahs may soon go in Iran. I think the Chinese people would rise up against the CCP, and even Rocket Boy would be turfed out of power. I think we got to look at this war not just in the downside if we lose, but in the upside if we can gather the people to win it. Because I think it will be a great thing for the future of the world to have a free Russia, to have a free Iran, a free China, a free North Korea. Why aren't we aiming to defeat these people like we defeated the Nazis? That must be the goal. And we've got 40 million Ukrainians who want to do it for us, and we need to give them every single ounce of support we can. It's in their interests, it's in Europe's interest, and it's in our interests. 100%. If we clear the fog of Russian propaganda out there, I joke, there's three main elements in Earth's atmosphere right now. There's oxygen, nitrogen, and Russian propaganda. If we can clear that fog away, and this here is an attempt to start doing that and really get this into perspective, we can win this war. The Ukrainian people can win, and we could see a much brighter future than we're now looking at. So thank you.
I would like to ask each one of you to give us your projection. Trevor just gave us a pretty good projection, but Victor, Claire, and Jeff, do you have any? What's your predictions for the future, near and far?
Well, let me kick it off, I guess. I can't give a projection without laying a very, very short groundwork, and that is the need to understand a phenomenon that has plagued our foreign policy establishment for 100 years. We have an affinity and an ability to take a deep dive into strategic sinkholes periodically, which then plagues the succeeding generations. Opening up China, so to speak, was supposed to have been a brilliant move. Didn't quite work out that way, did it? We did the same thing with China in 1979 that we did with the Soviet Union, ignoring warnings, extending diplomatic recognition, putting the Soviet Union on its feet in the 20s and 30s with massive economic and military aid. That didn't work out either. We repeated that again in the 1990s, putting Russia on its feet, pulling it back from the brink, stripping Ukraine from its arsenal. And we're at a fourth moment again now with the pullback on the military aid. Congress hasn't passed an aid package in over 400 days. My prediction is that if this continues, Ukraine is going to fall. It'll be totally occupied. There will be a bloodbath in the millions. Claire, the Holodomor that you mentioned, that was not a collectivization phenomenon because collectivization was extant throughout the Soviet Union. That was the last massive move to break Ukrainian resistance since the Russians invaded after World War I. And we can talk about that offline as well. But that was my point about what happened in the 30s being a template for what we can anticipate right now. And the bigger concern for Americans overall is that I think our credibility is just totally shot with our foes. As a matter of fact, these are not foes, they're not competitors. We have enemies. They will be tempted to go much further, much faster than they otherwise would be. And our allies, who are they going to rely on? We didn't have a good experience in Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, Ukraine. How long can people keep on counting, asking for a turnaround? I am very, very pessimistic about what's coming down the pike unless we turn things around very, very quickly. Europe will not be able to fill the breach. And if people are thinking about a negotiated settlement, the first question is, how do you enforce it? We have close to 500 agreements, bilateral and unilateral with bilateral and multilateral with Russia and Ukraine. We're in the enforcement phase right now of those agreements. This is what enforcement of international agreements is all about. This is what it comes to. And if we're not going to enforce it, no other agreement is going to make a bit of a difference. It'll be an enticement for further encroachments into Europe. And in the Pacific, we're going to see it with China. Claire?
Okay, so I guess I share Victor's grim outlook. Unless our Congress gets on the ball and quickly and passes, an assistance package, Ukraine already is running out of certain key critical ammunition types. I don't know, 155 artillery shells and other things, air defense. They could be pushed back. We know that that's the intention of Russia. That's exactly what I was talking about, what Putin and Medvedev want to do. We know that they have specifically and repeatedly named the Baltics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland as their next objectives. And I heard at least a couple mentions tonight of Moldova. As you know, Moldova sits on the western border of Ukraine, in between Ukraine and Romania. And there is an eastern slice of Moldova which lies to the east of the Dniester River. And therefore, that little slice is called the Transdniester or Transdnistria. And Russia has executed the exact same playbook already there in Transnistria as it did from 2014 onwards in the Donbass. And that is the so-called little green men In other words, they're not wearing the uniforms of Russia, some sort of camo uniform or green uniform or whatever. But they're Russians. They're Russian troops in Moldova right now, trying to slice that piece off of Moldova, just exactly as they began in 2014 to try to slice the Donbass off of Ukraine. So there's no doubt about where Russia wants to go. But now think about this in more geography. So recently, we just saw both Finland and Sweden joined into NATO. And that is in addition to come down from the north, the Baltic states already, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, then Germany, Slovakia, Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, of course, and as we said, Romania and Bulgaria. No, Moldova is not a member of NATO. But those other countries are, and they're right on the other side, more or less, of Ukraine to the west. And if they are invaded, and Putin has said that he wants to, Medvedev says that that's the intention, no reason to doubt them, then NATO is really involved. Now, you probably know there's Article 5 of the NATO treaty. Now, that doesn't absolutely mandate boots on the ground to come to the assistance of a member state invaded, but it does mandate military assistance. And I can't imagine how it would not come to boots on the ground. So think about that. Ukraine is holding the line right now for all the rest of Europe and NATO. And if we don't want to have to be committed even more than we already are, then we need to help Ukraine tout de suite, that's French, it means quickly, to hold the line against Putin and roll him back, take back their sovereign territory, and save their independence, save their freedom, not just for themselves, but for NATO, for the rest of Europe, and for the Westphalian sovereign nation state ideal.
Lauren, let me jump in just for a second. I don't want to preempt other people, but I do have to get this out. It's going to come as a shock to a lot of people that Ukraine is the largest country in Europe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's the size of England, Germany, Hungary, and Israel. That's the size of Ukraine. Ukraine is also, if you don't count ancient Egypt, Ukraine is the oldest democratic country in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
It had a constitution with checks and balances, separation of church and state, 77 years before the United States, before Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Law, before the Polish Constitution. And it had a Magna Carta 200 years before King John signed it in London. And in Ukraine, it wasn't done under duress. It was done voluntarily. So the significance of all of this is the credibility of things that we say, that we pronounce, that we declare about democracy, about the international order. And if you're not going to stand with a country such as Ukraine, with the examples that I gave earlier in my brief commentary at the beginning, then what are you going to do? Risk nuclear war over Liechtenstein or Luxembourg? Credibility is everything. We could have the biggest arsenal in the world, but if the brain behind the trigger finger isn't working, if the brain has been invaded and occupied, and half of our political spectrum has been, together with the remnants of the other half, then what can you expect?
But my projection is this, and it's pretty obvious. That country is undergoing an incredible trauma right now that they're not, it's going to take them generations to recover from. Their land, their people, their children, everything that is happening to them is on a level that is so obscene that the average American can't wrap their head around it. They are completely detached from it. They have no clue what is going on. And you can just see this narrative laundering going on Twitter, and you can see, people, Americans want to make really quick judgments regarding my Dan or anything else, and they want a quick answer, and they want somebody to blame very, very quickly. And it's kind of tragic in a way, because I see this war as an incredible moment in history. What is happening on the battlefield on a daily basis is fascinating to me. How the Bradleys are performing, how the Leopards are performing, how the Attackums are performing, how, everything that is happening on the battlefield. It's fascinating. And I think that Zelensky is an amazing leader. And so it's really sad to have the Ukrainian people so terribly slandered, and you're missing the what I see as the greatness of a brilliant man who stepped up to the plate to lead this country, and the American public is missing it. And I knew that this was happening because I was watching Ramzan Kadyrov's Telegram channel, and I was getting more truth from him about the battlefield, and it was completely contradicting what Steve Bannon was coming out and saying. And Lara Logan and everybody just piled on to these trashy narratives, and people believed them. They believed them hook, line, and sinker. And another projection is that when it comes to the conservative correspondents, I think they're being blindsided by the open source intelligence, because everybody has a cell phone, and they are recording this information and they're uploading it. They're going to be blindsided by the intelligence of the Ukrainian people. They're not going to see it coming. It's going to destroy their careers, and I am happy to help them get there. Because I think that the truth is so much better than what they're spinning and what they're telling us. And it's just, for lack of better terms, it's a remarkable time. And my intention is to watch it as much as possible. I hope to be able to get back to Ukraine and do more work over there, and just observe and make a better film, and do these kinds of things. And I'm grateful to be working with the people that I'm working with and learning from, including all of you. This is a powerful think tank, and I think we're doing really good work, and we're here to help. So Jeff, do you have any comments or on a projection before we let Larry chime in here with his question?
Yeah, I have a couple predictions, four kind of predictions. Of course, never make predictions, especially about the future. So I'll try not to make my predictions about the future. Victor said we have enemies, and that's right. The first rule in politics is know who your enemies are and know who your friends are. And this is what we've not been clear about. But Russia and China are the core of an enemy bloc of countries. And they have fellow travelers in fifth columns, and that's a longer story. But here's my four observations. China, which is, I think, wants to make trouble in the Far East, will not be able to make that trouble until Russia has won in Ukraine. My second one is the Persian Gulf is really volatile because Iran is close to developing its nuclear weapons, building them. Three, France, Germany, and Poland are beginning to shift toward Russia as Macron, Scholz, and Tusk connive to push America out of Europe. I think we've seen some of that already. I think that's going to be intensified in the future. And four is the pressure to cut off Ukraine in the United States and in Europe. There's going to be this pressure. It's going to reach a crisis point because I think that all the stops are being pulled out and all the favors are being called in. And I think we shouldn't underestimate this.
Thank you. Okay, Larry, go ahead and unmute yourself and direct your question.
Certainly. Well, thank you very much. And this has been a very insightful conversation with everybody. And I really appreciate everyone's viewpoints. My question really leads to how much of this, I should set this up with a bit of context. My background is in economics and finance, particularly private investments. So I approach everything from a very economical mindset. And I could view things from a historic and geographic perspective as to why Russia saber rattles every time NATO expands. They don't want a longer border, and that's geographically because of the Great European Plains. And if you look at history, World War II, they wanted to keep expanding past Berlin because they want as short a border as possible on their western flank. Now, the reason why you have today a lot of issues, it does stem right back to, as we stated, the same geographic problems of the Western Plain, which Napoleon took advantage of, as well as Hitler. Hitler's ultimate goal was to make it to Baku for the oil fields so he can run his fuel machine, he can fuel his war machine. That was the ultimate goal of going through Ukraine. Long term, it would have been for living space. But in terms of campaigns, what really stopped him was, yes, in Stalingrad, but also geographically, again, you have the Caucasus Mountain region where there's only one physical pass that you can really make it through, which is actually what's protecting that region today. Because with Russia having 20% of Georgia's country under their own control of their armies today, what's stopping essentially the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative of fully being completed by going and connecting, having that land connection between Iran and Russia today, is this one strategic little geopolitical area, which we seem to be ignoring in our policy and in our wider context and discussion of Ukraine. And I think it seems to get lost very much in the ideology as opposed to practicality of how we can actually influence foreign policy to secure our national interests. So I think I lost myself in my own question there because I tried to touch on so many points that everyone brought up. But I'm curious to hear everyone, time permitting, your perspectives on my rambles just now.
We got to get Trevor's predictions in here.
Yeah, the Belt and Road, does it weigh in?
Well, I would say I think it goes beyond that. This isn't just a strategic, to create a greater Russian empire. This is a whole world balance of power operation. This is to basically destroy the United States, to conquer Europe, dominate Asia, the whole lot. So Ukraine is absolutely critical to that. You can't really invade Europe or dominate Europe if you don't control Ukraine. And as Jeff said, Scholz, Macron, and Tusk are all leftists. Scholz spent most of his early days hobnobbing with East German communists. He loves Russia. He's the big problem we have is the Russians and their friends have so penetrated our societies. We're not allowed to see the enemy, and we're not allowed to fight the enemy even when we do. The big problem here is not so much what is happening in Ukraine, it's what's happening in the capitals of Europe and the United States. We got to win those battles.
Yeah.
Because we don't win those battles, we can't fight anything.
Excuse me. I've got actually one question and one statement I would like to make. The question is, I think all of you have heard about Donald Trump's loan plan to Ukraine. Does anyone have any info about the discussions in Congress, and do you think that will pass? I personally think it will more than it won't, and that's how I see it. So I think on the aid front, I'm not as pessimistic as maybe some on the panel would say. The second thing I would like to say is, I think a lot of conservatives have unfortunately fallen for, well, we all know they've fallen for the Russian propaganda, but then there's also a lot of this Vichyist element in American and European politics, is that they will say that we would save the West by capitulating like the Vichy French did to the Germans. And I think this is not the solution, and this should not be the solution for the free world. I think rather than being Philippe Pétain, I think Tucker Carlson should rather learn his inspiration from Charles de Gaulle instead and save this nation, save the United States, save Europe, and save the free world, and do what Trevor says has roll back communism, roll back the enemies of freedom, and decommunize the CCPIs and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, that's what I'd say.
Unfortunately, I actually think that what happened to Tucker was a very well calculated recruitment operation, essentially. And I don't think Tucker really does his homework. I think he has a staff which does a lot of the research for him. I don't think he knows his history. I don't think he does his homework. So he doesn't realize a lot of what was said here tonight about history, about the historical facts of tyrants, how they begin, how they continue if they're not stopped. I don't think he understands that at all.
I think he's sorry. I think he's also a grifter because, and you're right, he doesn't do his homework because he, first of all, he changed his stance on TikTok last year or 2 years ago. He was actually complimenting Marco Rubio for his brave stance against the Chinese app TikTok, but now he's apparently flip-flopped or something. And I think recently, a week ago, he was actually pranked by 2 British YouTubers, which was a total embarrassment for him, if not already.
Yeah.
So I don't know why anyone would trust what he says. I mean, he obviously doesn't do his homework. He's obviously doesn't know anything, or he's been
Well,
used.
Well, but that's exactly the problem with. Excuse me, Trevor. I'll be real quick here. That's the problem within the United States as well, is that our academic institutions have been long time penetrated, co-opted by the forces of communism and Marxism. And if all of you or any of you may perhaps be familiar with a 1958 book called The Naked Communist, written by a former FBI agent named W. Cleon Skousen, Skousen. There's a chapter in there, number 13, which is entitled The 45 Goals of Communism Today, meaning 1958, when it was published. And I won't go through them all, I promise. But number 17, I think, is apropos to what we're talking about here. Get control of the schools, of the curriculum, of the teachers' associations. This was laid out post-1917 by the Comintern, the international vehicle for the spread of the Bolshevik Revolution. They got into our academic institutions a long time ago. I just finished reading Christopher Rufo's new book, The American Cultural Revolution, which delves into some of the characters that were responsible for that penetration. Derek Bell comes to mind, and others as well, Herbert Marcuse. Our own academics have been taken over from within, at least at the upper university level, if not on down through, the K through 12 as well. This didn't just happen. This was planned, methodically executed, and continues to this day. I mean, go parents, at the school board meetings, but it's going to take a lot more than that.
I'd like to make one more comment. Sorry, Trevor, but I would like to make one more comment. Aid part. Do you think Trump's plan will work, or do you think Congress will actually pass it, or do you think I'm being too optimistic?
Well, I think we have to try and prevail on the sane elements in the Republican Party to pass aid now. There may not, by the time Trump's elected, there may not be in Ukraine. There may not be. If Ukraine falls, we may not even have an election because we could be in a general state of chaos around the world. So I'm hoping it does. I think Johnson is talking about moving a package fairly soon. But, you got the J.D. Vances of the world, and you've got all these people who are good on, like Tucker, good on domestic issues, but have zero clue on international issues or the implications of it. And just speaking about Tucker Carlson, when Amazon took down Alexander Dugin's books a while back, Tucker made a whole program bemoaning the fact. Alexander Dugin being the sort of philosophical cheerleader of the Ukraine invasion. And Tucker openly says, I'm rooting for Russia. He says this. These are his words. So, and I think there's a lot of blood in his hands, because if I think he hadn't done what he did, I think a lot of Republicans facing election in 2020 would have been a lot bolder for Ukraine. They're intimidated by Tucker and his base, which is very, very prevalent in part of the Republican Party now. So that's where we have to do our bit to challenge these people, to try and get something through for Ukraine really, really quickly. I think that's our number one priority right now.
There is a much even more fundamental issue that, again, nobody discusses. Whatever we do in life, whatever the activity, brain surgery, lawyering, fixing a computer, driving a car, whatever it is, we always want to have the advice of experienced people who know what they're talking about. We have never, ever undertaken a brutally frank self-assessment of ourselves. Why is it that in this area of foreign engagement, and particularly in dealing with countries that might as well be on the other side of the moon, countries and systems of quote unquote governance that we don't have any conception of, we have never listened to those people, to those nations who have dealt with this for generations, sometimes for centuries. Rather, our approach has been to dismiss, deny, denigrate, and sometimes insult people trying to make a point. We don't listen. We do not want to capitalize on their experience, number one. And number two, we don't have a sufficient memory even to take advantage of our own experience. We never grow up. We're toddlers, never learning by our experience and never becoming an adult. Ask anybody anything going back more than 10 years, they'll look at you with a blank stare on their face. We don't engage ourselves in questioning why and how we got to the situation that we're in now. Tucker Carlson, that is a symptom. It runs much deeper than that. And unfortunately, it also takes a lot more work and effort to try to address it and straighten it out somehow. That is a common recurring pattern throughout 100 years of dealing with Russia, the Soviet Union, China in the last two generations.
Thank you, Victor. That was excellent. So does the panel have any final thoughts? And then we'll close out the session. This has been wonderful. Hopefully we will all be able to get together and do this again. And thank you for everyone who showed up tonight. And we hope that you learned something from it and gained some inspiration from this. Do we have any final thoughts from anyone before we close the meeting?
I think Victor Rudd made a very good point about kicking the can down the road. However, I would like to add that I think the can hasn't not only started in 1945 or 1970 with the Nixon-Mao meeting. I think it actually goes back to probably the First World War and the Allied responses to the White Revolution. If the reason why the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Allies didn't crush the Reds and the Bolsheviks in the Russian Civil War is because of war fatigue, and it's understandable because First World War happened, people die, and all that kind of stuff. But imagine if the Allies has actually stopped the Bolsheviks, then of course more people would die, and it's tragic. But then the cost will be far less than what we have to do now, which is a whole coalition of nations, far more expensive, far more lives lost. So I think a lot of the anti-war sentiment in the past, while some of it, of course, is Soviet propaganda, but a lot of it is definitely kicking the can down the road or naivety. So I think a lot of the anti-war sentiment for the sake of it is very immoral, I think, because like Victor Rudd said, he's absolutely right about making the problems worse and worse and worse. And we have to face the enemy anyway. Russia's not gone. China's not gone. And we're seeing a whole Eastern Bloc against the West again.
Well, the Ukrainian delegation to the Paris Peace Conference wasn't allowed to have a seat at the table, and Woodrow Wilson's 14 points didn't apply to Ukraine. And the warning from the Ukrainians was, if Ukraine is reoccupied by Russian forces and if the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire is reconstituted as a now retooled Soviet Union, then the West within a generation's time is going to be faced with an existential problem on its hands from Russia. That was one example I had in mind when I was talking about the warnings from other countries, other nations that we ignored. And we thought we knew better. Well, we thought we knew better after the war, after World War II, so on and so forth through the present day. That is a problem. It is a conceit and arrogance, I think, that is rooted in the fact that we are not a cosmopolitan country. We don't care about geography. We don't know history. We know even less about geography. We don't have any sensitivities to it. And I think it is ingrained in our DNA. We have a mercantile culture. We want stability. We want to manage things. We want predictability. And the way to do that, you reach an agreement. And once you reach an agreement, problem solved. Well, no, with Russia, an agreement is just the beginning of a new problem and additional problems. It is a cultural, political, philosophical dichotomy that we don't even understand that exists.
We tend to mirror image, don't we? We think that because
we project all the time. We project all the time. Yes.
We think that because we think that there's always a compromise, there's always a way to come together in the middle somehow. We think that way, that others do too. They do not.
Hence the reason for our strategic slide with the Soviet Union. We had a monopoly after World War II, as you know. And where were we in the 1980s already? We were going down the slippery slope in terms of our strategic armed forces vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. And the road between point A and point B was littered with agreements. The spirit of Glassboro, the spirit of Vienna, the spirit of Geneva. We got snookered.
Yeah. This is why I think we have to confront the central problem of our time, that there is evil in the world and it's our responsibility to defeat it. And that is the message we have to put out there, because we've compromised, we've, taken this business-like approach, and it's gotten us nowhere, to the point that we're on the verge of destruction, not just Ukraine. So, we've tried everything else. Let's try telling the truth, calling out evil, and it's got to be our duty to defeat it. And that's the message we should be trying to get out there.